Street homeless people in America are genuinely suffering, right? They're genuinely vulnerable. Of course, they need compassion, right? But what compassion looks like when you're so ill and so high a lot of times that you're shouting at no one, that you're threatening people just walking down the street, you need to be institutionalized fundamentally.
And on the Michael Medved show, whenever people talk about the problem of homelessness, of people living on the streets and in parks, people emphasize the word compassion. But there is a powerful argument put forward by a writer in the Wall Street Journal, Emma Camp, who is a senior newsletter editor at Free Expression. She argues that compassion is exactly the wrong idea in terms of what homeless people really need. You have written about the mistaken application of the idea of compassion. What do homeless people need more and instead of compassion?
I mean, a lot of times, so I guess to back up a little, why I wrote this article is I was seeing online this strain of discussion that comes up every couple months over and over, where a lot of people, oftentimes they're sort of self-described leftists, will say, if you are uncomfortable when there is a homeless person on public transport who is ranting and raving and just generally being kind of scary and menacing, if you're uncomfortable with that, you're the problem. So, there's usually they either say that you're a big baby or you're a fascist. And I think that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. Street homeless people in America are genuinely suffering, right? They're genuinely vulnerable. This is a group of people that we should care about. So when I say I'm against the way compassion is often constructed in how we talk about this group of people. Like, of course they need compassion, right? But what compassion looks like when you're so ill and so high a lot of times that you're shouting at no one, that you're threatening, people just walking down the street, you need to be institutionalized fundamentally, right? These people who are freezing to death, who are just really in horrible states of degradation, they can't take care of themselves and they're threats to other people a lot of times. Some occasionally a couple times a year here in New York City, a crazy homeless person will push a woman in front of the subway tracks and kill her or seriously injure her. And every single time this happens, you find out that this person had dozens of prior arrests, often for very serious violent crimes. And when we're in a situation where someone is that much of a threat to the community, they do need to be removed from it. And again, oftentimes, obviously institutionalizing someone should never be taken lightly, but being put in a hospital where you're cared for and forced to take medication, ultimately you're going to be better off than you would be just being on the streets. And so I think often when someone says this and says, like someone who is threatening to kill me as I'm walking down the street and who is clearly out of their minds, like that is a threat and that needs to be taken care of. It's, well, why are you so incompassionate? I literally had someone when I was talking about this online say, I'm just asking you to see homeless people as human. It's like, of course I see them as human. But I don't know why you assume the compassionate response is to do nothing and just to allow this like deeply antisocial and often quite threatening behavior to continue.
Okay, the idea here is people will come up and say, no, homeless people don't need institutionalization. They don't need medical attention. What they need is homes. What about that attitude, housing first, which is something on the left that people have been emphasizing for years?
I mean, I prefer that to often what I end up hearing online. At least the kind of housing first people recognizes that something needs to be done, right? Um, I think that whether housing availability does relate to street homelessness, the homelessness rate is higher in places where there are fewer places to live and where rents are higher. Um, how that relates to specifically the people who are kind of out of their minds is more complicated. In New York, for example, there's a guaranteed right to shelter. So you are legally obligated to be offered a shelter bed if you ask for someone. Um, And so I would at least I would prefer someone that's offering reasonable policy solutions. But a lot of times what it feels like is that, these are people who essentially want anarchy, who don't really they don't even have a reasonable policy solution. It's just you should just do nothing because it infringes on this person's personal liberty to be asked to not relieve themselves in the middle of the subway or to not sleep on a public street. And it really it surprises me so much because this viewpoint, it seems to believe that there are no negative externalities to this kind of behavior. And I think some of it comes from this is very common in the left, this sort of ranking of people based on how oppressed they are, like because the street homeless are genuinely vulnerable, right? They are, you could call them oppressed, but like they are suffering. Therefore, me as someone who has a home and a safe place to live, I'm not oppressed. Therefore, if the homeless person can never hurt me, right? Like they can never do something that would cause me to be victimized by them, which makes no sense. Like something I wrote about in the piece, and this is something that happened that I'm still a little mad about, as you could tell, because I wrote about it. I was in church in Washington, D.C., where I lived for 3 years, and I was leaving, and there was a homeless man who was exposing himself in a pew. And I immediately found the nearest member of the clergy and told him, I said, this is happening. And he totally brushed me off, right? This deacon at the church I was at, he said, oh, that's just, I don't remember the person's name. He was like, oh, that's just Mike. I was like, what do you mean? I was dumbstruck. I didn't know what to say. I was so shocked that that was the response. And then I found where my friends were talking after mass. And I said, oh my gosh, this happened. And I was totally brushed off. And one of my friends went, well, Emma, church should be a place for everyone.
Okay,
I was
given
like,
that
okay,
kind
apparently
of,
it's not for women and children who don't want to see men exposing themselves. And of course, if I had complained about literal and any man who wasn't homeless doing this, it would have been taken very seriously. Because then, of
and by the
course,
way,
it would be a
how
man
do they
victimizing a woman.
how do they know that he is homeless? In other
I mean,
words,
it was how the person was obviously street homeless because of how they were
okay,
dressed.
all right.
And just other, it's sort of it was obvious that this person, and this church was in the middle of the city with a large homelessness population in the area.
Are there any cities in the country right now that are doing better with this problem and actually helping to clear people out of the parks and off the streets and stop the oppression of other people by homeless people?
So the places with the lowest homelessness rates are places where housing is easier to obtain. Um, so this is places like the Deep South. So like I'm from Alabama, the homelessness rate is much lower there. And oftentimes people will say, how can this be the case? Like these people are just crazy. That's why they're on the streets. It can be a bit more complicated because a lot of the statistics around homelessness group in people who are temporarily in unstable situations, say people who are couch surfing, but who are not the kind of crazy street homeless person that we often think of. But a lot of times what happens, let's say you have a brother who is schizophrenic or struggling with drug use and is, very likely to become street homeless. Let's say housing is cheaper in the place where you live, so you live in a 2-bedroom apartment because you can afford it. You might be able to have your brother in that extra bedroom, make sure he gets the treatment he needs so he doesn't wind up on the streets. In a place like New York where housing is very expensive, that same person might live in a studio apartment, so they have no room for their sibling, and so that person might be more likely to end up on the street. So there are public policy decisions that can be made. One of them is also just enforcing the law. Like if someone is committing violent crimes, I think a lot of times people on the left, they're one of the reasons why they're anti-prison is that they go, well, this doesn't reverse the harm that happened when someone is, a victim of a violent crime. And my response to that is the main reason to have prisons is to protect the community. If there is someone who is going to go around, say punching people unprovoked, which happened in New York for a while, they should be removed from the community to protect everyone else. And so
And look,
unfortunately, yeah.
this is such an important issue, and the perspective is so much needed by Emma Camp. People can read her outstanding column from the Wall Street Journal at our website. Go to michaelmedved.com. Keep up the fight for sanity and, yes, compassion, because it is not compassion to allow people to wallow in drug addiction and insanity on our streets or elsewhere in this greatest nation on God's green earth.